Welcome to Old World Order Theology with Brian Newberry. Today's topic will be the Syllabus of Errors. Before we get started, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the subscribe button below and hit the bell so you'll be notified when the new shows come. And like this video and share it with your friends. I'd appreciate it. Okay, so we're continuing with the pontificate of Blessed Pope Pius IX, and the reason why I'm kind of beginning with this pontificate in history and kind of moving forward is because I want to establish traditional Catholicism, the teaching with traditional Catholicism, and eventually we're going to get to the teachings of the Vatican II Council and how that actually played out, and then we'll decide if there's a hermeneutic of continuity or rupture, meaning did the Vatican II Council change or at least imply a change in theology and a change from the church in the past. And what's interesting about the Syllabus of Errors, as being a list of errors which were problematic in the 19th century under the pontificate of Pope Pius IX. We're going to see that the Syllabus of Errors was specifically contradicted in the Vatican II Council, and several quotes, including that of Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. He specifically said, he called the Vatican II Council a counter-syllabus, meaning they thought that this syllabus needed to be changed, that there are errors in it. Now, granted that the Syllabus of Errors is not extraordinary magisterium, meaning it's not necessarily infallible, but it still is ordinary magisterium, which usually means that the church should be following it in general. But if Vatican II is a counter-syllabus, it really puts into question, does the church get to change courses when it comes to general magisterium, and especially with a document as ambiguous as Vatican II? So are we supposed to embrace ambiguous ordinary magisterium rather than specific and consistent magisterium such as the Syllabus of Errors? The Syllabus of Errors is not ambiguous, and Catholic documents before the Vatican II era were always very precise. So we're going to get into it. This is going to be a two-parter, so there are 10 sections of the Syllabus of Errors. I'm going to go through 5 today, time permitting, and then 5 the next episode, and we'll get an idea of some of the problems really kind of coming to the surface in the mid-19th century that Pius IX is dealing with. And we'll also see that these ideas have manifested and grown in our day. And so Pius IX is trying to nip it in the bud. He's trying to attack it early so it doesn't have time to grow and develop and become the monster that we're dealing with today, the beast, if you will. So let's begin. The Syllabus of Errors by Blessed Pope Pius IX. Section 1 deals with pantheism, naturalism, and absolute rationalism. So let's define those terms really quick. Pantheism is the belief that everything in creation is, or at least a part of, God. So everything is God. Everything in nature, trees, water, wind, the ecology, the climate, right? People, we're all part of the God consciousness, some might say. So pantheism is kind of the theological framework of Hinduism and Buddhism and a lot of Eastern oriented religions. And if you just want to say paganism in general, yeah, that's what that is. Naturalism is the framework of interpreting reality only according to the laws of nature, right? Only what we could see what we can observe and test with the five senses. That's what naturalism is. So that's contrary to supernaturalism, which would include the laws of nature, but also the laws revealed by God. And then absolute rationalism, meaning that human reason is the primary authority of truth and arbiter of truth. Okay, so first, now when I mention these errors, these are going to be the errors that are condemned by the Church and Pius IX. So what I'm about to read isn't statements by Pius IX, meaning things that we should hold to. These are the errors that he's condemning. Okay, number one. First error, that no supreme, all-wise, and all-provident divine Godhead exists, distinct from this world of things, and God is the same as nature of things, and therefore liable to changes. And God comes into being in man and the universe, and all things are God, and they have the same substance of God. And God is one and the same as the world, and therefore also spirit is one and the same with matter, necessity with liberty, truth with the false, the good with the evil, and the just with the unjust. Okay, so this is really a good description of pantheism. And so we have some ideas in the American Constitution, such as freedom of religion. So you cannot hold that all religions are equally true and false at the same time, and everybody has the right to do it, those kind of things. Or that there's no absolute such thing as good or evil, or truth or falsehood, that everything is relative to the individual. So that would definitely go against that. Okay, error number two, quote, all action of God upon men and the world must be denied, close quote. So the denial of God acting in the world. So what this condemns is deism. And deism is the belief that God created everything, wound it up like a clock, and then let it go, and then left it for us to decide. So number two is definitely anti-deism, and which many of the founders of America's founders were deists, not all, but many. Freemasons are in a way deists, although when you get to the higher levels, they get into the occult, so they're not thorough deists. And also secularism in general, that if you want to believe in God and religion, that's your private affair, but in public we don't bring God into the mix, right? Or the famous maxim, don't discuss religion and politics kind of things, or the assumption that the two don't mix. Okay, error number three, quote, human reason, with absolutely no regard to God, is the only judge of true and the false, the good and the evil. It is a law unto itself, and is, by its own natural powers, sufficient to provide for the good individuals and of peoples, close quote. Okay, so that's kind of like what I said about absolute rationalism, that all decisions must be made outside of any religious orientation or bringing God into it. Although it's kind of ironic, you'll have that kind of rule in secular affairs, but when you go to a courtroom in America, you put your hand on the Bible and swear an oath to tell the truth. So it's not, that's about as much as it gets. It's kind of ceremonial. Error number four, quote, all truths of religion flow from the natural power of human reason. Hence, reason is the chief norm by which man can and should come to a knowledge of all truths of whatever kind, close quote. Okay, so basically, instead of God being transcendent and revealing truth from above, this error would be what we call immanence, or divine immanence, meaning that God works in primarily and even ultimately in and through nature and through the human reason. So instead of a God out there, it's the God in here. And the God testifies to my spirit and brings things to my mind, and therefore I reason these things out. And that's the means and arbiter of truth. So that's definitely condemned here. Error number five. Divine revelation is imperfect and therefore subject to continuous and indefinite progress, which corresponds to the progress of human reason. Close quote. Okay, so basically, divine revelation meaning the dogmas of the church, the Bible, being imperfect and subject to, it says, continuous and indefinite progress, which is evolution, the evolution of truth. So Darwin's theory of evolution doesn't pertain only to nature in this era. It also pertains to the academic world, the intellect, and even religious matters. So everything is in a state of flux, and everything has to evolve with time and move towards a positive progress, right, of human nature. So as I've said before on this channel, the progressivism is anti-Christian. The two do not mix. And evolution similarly. So there's a great quote I heard. It says, there's a misconception that movement in any direction is progression, meaning that all changes is necessarily a positive evidence of progress, which is false. Error number 6, quote, the faith of Christ is opposed to human reason, and divine revelation is not only of no benefit to, but even harms the perfection of man, close quote. All right, so we've heard this before, that faith and reason are contrary to one another. Religion and reason and logic, contradict. So we don't want religion in society. We don't want faith being a part of our everyday lives, because then that would get in the way of reason and the way of progress. So that's definitely condemned here. Error number 7. The prophecies and miracles described and related in Scripture are the inventions of poets, and the mysteries of the Christian faith are the culmination of philosophical investigations. And the books of both testaments are contained mythical inventions, and Jesus Christ himself is a mythical fiction. Close quote. We've heard this before. This is also in line with deism being condemned here. That a lot of the early American founders, such as Thomas Jefferson or Thomas Paine, they might have had a high respect for the morality of the Bible, but as far as the miracles, they didn't believe them, right? And then modernist scholars, or read liberal scholars of theology in the Bible, they're always trying to explain away the miracles of the Bible with natural explanations instead. Some of them quite ridiculous, like, oh, Jesus didn't really walk on water. In fact, the lake was frozen and he was walking on top of the frozen lake. So that's what was described as walking on water. But if he did that, the disciples weren't stupid. They would have known that the lake was frozen, and it would have been it would have been a non-issue. Why even record it as such a feat, a miracle, right? And we've probably seen documentaries that coincidentally always come up around Easter and Christmas time, explaining away the miracles of the Bible, the 7 plagues of the Exodus, with scientific explanations instead. So or that these are mythical accounts, just like Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, such forth. We're bringing in religious and legends to explain history and so forth. That's a common error that modernists and liberals use to discount any authority that divine revelation has. And some will even say Jesus was not a historical person, and he was a myth. The problem with that is there are multiple historical sources outside of Christianity that confirm his existence. The Babylonian Talmud, Roman historians such as Tacitus, Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, and many others. So Jesus was indeed a real person, and the historical Jesus and the biblical Jesus are one and the same man. Okay, section 2, modified rationalism. So this isn't absolute rationalism, this is modified rationalism. So it'll deal with this. So this is philosophical in nature here. Error number 8. Quote, since human reason is equal to religion itself, therefore theological studies must be conducted just as the philosophical. Close quote. Now, anyone who's been to a seminary in recent decades probably has realized that a lot of theological study is done, via scientific methods, right? So they study theology, the Bible, and religion as one of the sciences, or religion as being kind of fitting into sociology, right? Purely, or anthropology, purely a human phenomena guided by culture only, with discounting any supernatural or transcendent divine will, right? So this is condemned here. Error number 9, quote, all the dogmas of the Christian religion without distinction are the object of natural science or philosophy, and human reason, cultivated so much throughout history, can, by its natural powers and principles, arrive at the true knowledge of all. Even the more hidden dogmas, provided these dogmas have been proposed to reason itself, has its object. Close quote. So that kind of continues from the last one. That really describes all of today's study of such things, condemned back then, over 150 years ago. Error number 10, quote, since a philosopher is one thing and philosophy another, the former has the right and the duty to submit himself to the authority which he himself has proved to be true. But philosophy cannot and should not submit itself to any authority. Close quote. So this error outright dismisses the Catholic Church and the Bible as being authoritative. So the philosopher himself is the authority, this error says, and only that which he can prove to be true should be held as true. So basically this is scientism. If it cannot be proved using the scientific method, then it should be doubted and debated rigorously. That's what this error is saying. So if you haven't already, please go back and watch my video of scientism and see the flaws of that kind of philosophy. Error number 11. The church should not only never pay attention to philosophy, but should also tolerate the errors of philosophy and leave it to correct itself. Close quote. So basically this error says that the church should mind its own business and not stick its nose in philosophical matters. The problem is that proper theology must be done through a prism of philosophy, right? Even logic. So basically they're saying that Thomas Aquinas was wrong, and basically all the theologians of the church were wrong to use philosophy in the first place, and that the church should stay out of it. Error number 12, quote, the decrees of the Apostolic See and the Roman congregations hinder the free progress of science, close quote. So same thing. So this kind of goes back into the Galileo thing, where Galileo and the Pope had some beef. So the fairy tale goes that the church had taught that, as a dogma, that the sun goes around the earth, geocentrism, in other words, and that Galileo was under Copernicus's teachings had taught that the earth goes around the sun. So they always like to use that example of why the church should stay out of scientific matters. But actually that account is much more complicated than that. In fact, there were 4 competing theories at the time of Galileo. And Galileo's theory, or what most people assume to be a fact today, isn't quite as concrete as we might think. Because Einstein's theory of relativity has actually shown that everything in space moves, so everything kind of goes around everything. So it's not like the sun is stationary and the earth just orbits around the sun, strictly speaking. So the case from relativity can be made that the sun also kind of does go around the earth, although not in quite the same way that ancients might have understood it. But the issue with the Pope and Galileo was more of Galileo's attitude and his arrogance more than his scientific findings. So don't believe that myth of kind of a false dichotomy, which is often presented in modern textbooks. So in any way, that it is an error condemned by the church that the church should stay out of scientific matters, because the church is very much interested in true science. Now, scientific theories, the church does not have to accept. Okay, error number 13, quote, the method and principles according to which the ancient scholastic doctors treated theology are by no means suited to the necessities of our times and to the progresses of the sciences, quote, close quote. So basically, this error wants to get rid of St. Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle and philosophers like that, using that method of inductive logic, because those things get in the way of progress. That would be kind of backwards kind of thinking, although that use of scholastic theology is very reasonable. So they don't want to use that kind of reasoning with science. They want science to guide progress and not theology. And I would agree in the sense that scholastic philosophy and theology is a definite enemy of the progressive movement, because it shows its errors. It reveals its errors. So this is not just an attempt to separate religion from science per se. This is because St. Thomas Aquinas is not a biblical fundamentalist in the sense that he doesn't employ sound reason and methods of reasoning. In fact, that kind of idea is dangerous to the progressive and to those who succumb to scientism, because it's very thorough, and it will undo a lot of the scientific theories which are being kind of pushed as dogmas themselves into society. So you have to remember, the secular world, under the principles of the Freemasons, they don't want religion. They don't want the Catholic Church to be part of religion, or they don't want the Catholic Church to be part of, rather, society or any of the scholastic methods, because it's a threat. It's a war of authority, and that's what it comes down to. Either the Catholic Church is the authority under God, or the individual or the group of individuals under the guise of science are the authority. So that's really what it comes down to. Error number 14, quote, philosophy is to be treated without any regard to supernatural revelation, close quote. So again, naturalism, and all modernism kind of puts supernaturalism in a separate category. Modernism really embraces naturalism and rationalism and so forth. Okay, section number 3, indifferentism and latitudinarianism. Error number 15, quote, every man is free to embrace and profess that religion which he, led by the light of reason, thinks to be the true religion, close quote. So again, this kind of goes with the idea of religious liberty, or the freedom of religion. I get to choose whatever religion I think is the most reasonable, as long as reason declares it to be okay. So this is an error condemned by the church. Number 16, in the worship of any religion whatever, men can find the way to eternal salvation and can attain eternal salvation, close quote. So that we had an episode earlier of religious indifferentism being condemned by the church, by the scriptures. The kind of philosophy that all roads lead to God, or you might have heard some famous bishops erroneously claim that Jesus is merely the privileged way to God, but there are other ways. So that has been condemned here. Error number 17, quote, we must have at least good hope concerning the eternal salvation of all those who in no wise are in the true church of Christ, close quote. So again, this is a modern error taught by, sadly, even many Catholics, that all men of good will be saved, although this kind of goes against the idea of original sin and the default position of reprobation of man without supernatural intervention and without the sacraments. And it goes against the extra ecclesiam nulus salus doctrine of the church, meaning no salvation outside of the Catholic Church. So the idea that as long as a person is honest, according to whatever they believe, that God will save them is an error. Error number 18, quote, Protestantism is nothing else than a different form of the same true Christian religion, in which it is possible to serve God as well as in the Catholic Church, close quote. Now, this would definitely contradict, there's a section in the Vatican II documents that claims that salvation is merited by the Protestant services, which is only technically true in the sense that if a Protestant offers the Catholic form of baptism, that baptism is valid and saves. The problem is when they continue to teach errors, they nullify the effects of the baptism when the person becomes of age, and they embrace the errors. So this error here is basically saying that all Christian sects are equally valid and equally salvific. The problem comes in was when you really study the doctrines of a lot of the Protestant churches, you realize that they're hopelessly contradictory not only to one another, but with Catholic dogma. For example, how can a Protestant sect that teaches that the papacy is the Antichrist possibly be reconciled with the Catholic Church? How can they possibly even be called a separated brethren when they teach that the Pope is Antichrist? I mean, there are a lot of examples of irreconcilable doctrines, so you can't say that they're all equally true Christian religions with a different take on it. It's just not logically possible. So either one is true and one is false, or they're both false, but they can't both be true. Section 4, socialism, communism, secret societies, biblical societies, and clerical liberal societies. Quote, evils of this sort have been reproved often and in very severe words in the encyclical letter Qui Pluribus, November 9, 1846, and the allocution Quibus Quantisque, April 20, 1849, and the encyclical epistle Nostis et Nobiscum, December 8, 1849, and the allocution Singulari Qualum, December 9, 1854, and the encyclical epistle Quanto Conficiamur Morerore, August 10, 1863. So he doesn't actually go into a specific error here. He's just condemning all of these things. Socialism, communism, secret societies, biblical societies, clerical liberal societies. He's condemning them all with one stroke by alluding to previous encyclicals. So then we go into our final section that we're going to cover today, Section 5, Errors Concerning the Church and its Rights. Now this is very important, and the last episode that we did, or one of the last episodes, maybe not the last, meaning, pointing out the errors of the separation of church and state. That's what this has to do with here. Error number 19. The church is not a true and perfect society, absolutely free, nor does it operate by its own fixed and proper rights, conferred on it by its divine founder, but it belongs to the civil power to define which are the rights of the church, and the limits within which it may exercise these rights, close quote. So this error subordinates the church under the state. It says that the church is not a true and perfect society, which the Catholic Church has always taught. Meaning perfect society doesn't mean that all the members of the society are perfect. It just means that it's perfectly ordered, and ordered by Jesus Christ, its divine founder. So basically saying the civil powers have authority over the church. And as I speak right now, today being May the 3rd, 2020, the church has indeed submitted and bent the knee to the civil powers and has closed down all masses and sacraments under the authority of the state. So very sad. that this error has not been continued to be taught as an error. Error number 20, quote, the ecclesiastical power should not exercise its authority without the permission and assent of the civil government, close quote. So same thing. The church is a separate society than civil society, and it operates under its own authority. It doesn't need the permission of presidents, congresses, governors, or mayors. Not in the least bit. Error number 21. The church does not have the power of defining dogmatically that the religion of the Catholic Church is the only true religion, close quote. So again, that perennial doctrine of the Catholic Church, that there is no salvation outside of the Catholic Church because it's the only church founded by Jesus Christ and the only true church. So this is an error against that idea. Although those who teach this error, who gave them the authority to teach that? You have to ask that question. Error number 22. The obligation by which Catholic teachers and writers are absolutely bound is restricted to those matters only which are proposed by the infallible judgment of the Church, to be believed by all as dogmas of the faith. So basically saying that the teachers of Catholicism, the catechists, are not allowed to teach about things outside of the church. That's what this error is saying, which is utter nonsense, because the state actually is subordinate to the church. So the matters of the state are also applicable to the teachers of doctrine in the church. Error number 23. Quote, the Roman pontiffs and the ecumenical councils have trespassed the limits of their powers, have usurped the rights of princes, and have even erred in defining matters of faith and morals, close quote. So that's a mouthful there. They've trespassed their limits of powers. So again, this assumes that the state has the authority to bind the church according to their authority, right? And when you read church history, indeed, popes and bishops have demanded that princes and royalty are subject to the church. There's even the episode where an emperor was forced to wait outside in the snow for a meeting with the Pope because he had been excommunicated, and he was begging the Pope's forgiveness so he can continue to be a good son of the church. And there are various examples of that. That's also why in the French Revolution, 1789, that they were beheading priests and nuns and royal people in the streets because they wanted to get rid of such authority. They wanted to subject the church to the state. So that's an error here. And this error also says that the church has even made errors defining faith and morals. So now all of a sudden you have the state actually usurping their own authority by saying that the church is wrong when it comes to faith and morals. So if the state would be consistent, they would say that faith is out of their jurisdiction and even morals out of their jurisdiction. But here they themselves are trespassing on what their obligation is. Of course, if you want a secular state, if you want communism or socialism, you don't want the church to be absolutely correct regarding faith and morals, because then it would contradict the laws being proposed by the state. So again, this is about authority and power. The state wants to be absolutely authoritative and powerful in all areas of life, including faith and morals. So they want the Catholic Church to go away. And Pope Pius IX is doing battle against these ideas and against the secular authorities and saying, no, you guys are wrong. Error number 24. The church does not have the power of using force, nor does it have any temporal power, direct or indirect, close quote. So they don't want the church to have, its own executive branch. That would be including the Swiss Guard, which protects the Pope from attack. And when you read history, Napoleon kidnapping the Pope twice, those kind of things. They don't want these things to be prevented. It's an issue of power and authority. Error number 25. Quote, beside the power inherent in the episcopate, there is another temporal power attributed either expressly or tacitly granted by the civil government to be revoked, therefore at will by the civil government. So they want this error says that the state has the authority to govern even the ecclesiastical orders and bishops of the church. And we see this in communist regimes. Like for example, today in communist China, the Chinese communist government has instituted its own bishops. And the same thing happened after the French Revolution. The French instituted their own bishops according to their own propaganda. And the true Catholic bishops who refused to submit to the state were either killed, imprisoned, or forced underground, as is what is happening in China today. And sadly, even Pope Francis has succumbed to the authority of the Chinese government and has permitted them to ordain their own bishops. So that is a contradiction here with Pope Pius IX. Number 26, quote, "The Church does not have a natural and legitimate right to acquire and possess," close quote. So this error is condemning the idea that the Church cannot have its own property and rights. Number 27, quote, "The sacred ministers of the Church and the Roman Pontiff should be entirely excluded from all administration and dominion over temporal things," close quote. So this error says that the authority of the Pope and the bishops cannot have any dominion over, any authority over temporal things, meaning things that aren't specifically church-oriented. So they're saying that your private personal life has nothing to do with the authority of the church. That's what this error is saying. Number 28, quote, "Without the permission of the government, it is not lawful for the bishops to issue even apostolic letters." So imagine that the Pope and the bishops would have to get permission from the governors to even write encyclicals and make decrees in the church. So that's an error. So these things were prominent in the 19th century, and they're still prominent today in some parts of the world. Error number 29, quote, "Favors granted by the Roman Pontiff should be considered void unless they have been requested through the government." So this is a direct attack on the authority of the Pope, the Vicar of Christ on earth, saying that he has to get permission from the government. So again, this is a struggle between the authority of government versus the church. Number 30, quote, "The immunity of the church and ecclesiastical persons had its origin in civil law." So that's a very strange thing, that the civil law granted the authority of the church their immunity from matters of state persecution. So this is kind of relevant in the sense that we have the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, and so you have the cover-up within the church, unfortunately, by these wolves in sheep's clothing, and the state cannot do anything against it. And rightfully, this angers a lot of people, and it's okay to be angry about the cover-up by the people in the church, but we don't want to start down the slippery slope that the state goes into the church and starts to deal in church matters, and that would be an usurpation of their authority. Although it's tempting to say that, yeah, they should do it. They should force documents to be handed over to the state and so forth. That's actually, the Pope should do that. So traditionally what happens is that if there is a grave criminal act in the church, such as sexual abuse, the bishop should hand once the person has been found guilty under a just investigation and a trial, then the person is defrocked and handed over to be civilly prosecuted, even given death. That's traditionally how it's been handled. But ever since the French Revolution and the separation of church and state, this has become problematic, and it's become very messy and complicated. Whereas before, if church and state are properly joined and are in parallel in the direction they're heading, then these kind of issues are not really a problem. So we have to be careful when we say that, yeah, the state should be able to go into the church and start bossing them around regarding criminal acts. The church, if it were righteous and holy as it is intended to be, should be cleaning up itself. The problem is they're not really doing that right now because the corruption and the infiltration is so massive that they're covering for each other, and that's unfortunate. So how do we resolve the issue? That's a topic for another time, but it is erroneous to think that the civil authorities have the authority to go in and kick the door in of the church and start giving orders. That's an error. Error number 31. The ecclesiastical court for the temporal cases of clerics, whether civil or criminal, should be absolutely abolished, even if the Apostolic See was not consulted and protests. Close quote. So again, the same issue, that the internal authority and investigation of the church should be abolished. That's the thing. Error number 32, quote, without any violation of natural right and equity, the personal immunity by which clerics are exempted from obligation and undergoing and practicing military service can be abolished. In truth, civil progress demands this abrogation, especially in a society organized on the form of a more liberal government, close quote. So basically this error is saying that ordained clergy should be subject to military draft. Basically saying that their holy orders, the sacrament of holy orders, should be abrogated when the need to enlist men in the military comes about by the state. So again, this is the authority of church versus state, and that holy orders should be, a sacrament given by Christ should be subjected to the state. The church has always fought against this idea. Always. So that's kind of a big one there. Error number 33, quote, it does not belong exclusively to the ecclesiastical power of jurisdiction by proper and natural right to direct the teaching of theological matters. So again, this is the idea that the state has the authority to tell the church how to teach theology, which is really absurd considering the secularist and naturalist nature of the state. Unfortunately, in seminaries today, the church does this voluntarily, namely teaching naturalism and secularism in a sense, and divine eminence. We call that modernism. They did that voluntarily. So the state doesn't even need to tell the church to teach this way anymore. They do it all by themselves because of the infiltration of modernism. Number 34, quote, the doctrine of those who compare the Roman pontiff to a free prince acting in the universal church is the doctrine which prevailed in the Middle Ages, close quote. It's also an error not only taught by statists and secularists, but it's also an error taught by Eastern Orthodox, that the papacy, as we understand it today, was invented in the Middle Ages. You can go back to the very early age of the church, and you see popes had a lot of authority. I'm not going to get into that topic here. Maybe in a future episode I'll do that. But if you want an authority to consult with plenty of references on that, just see St. Robert Bellarmine, his teaching against controversies. He refutes that idea very soundly. Number 35, quote, there is nothing to forbid that by the vote of a general council or by the action of all peoples, the supreme pontificate be transferred from the Roman bishop and the city to another bishopric and another city, close quote. So basically saying that the Roman See is not the Holy See which governs the whole church. So although in the great schism of the 14th and 15th century, you had the Avignon papacy where the popes preferred to stay in Avignon, France, and they kind of abandoned their natural rights over the Roman See, which would be an error. We've since repented from that error, and we've been in Rome ever since. That's the eternal city. Just read Daniel chapter 7, verse 26 and verse 27, and you'll see that it was prophesied and fulfilled that the city of the fourth beast, which was the pagan Roman Empire in the first century, would be given to the saints of the Most High, which would be Rome, which is why the Catholic Church is centered in Rome, by the Roman See. Error number 36, quote, the definition of a national council allows no further discussion, and the civil administration can force the matter to those boundaries. So this is pretty self-explanatory here. Civil administrations believing that they can force their jurisdiction on the church. That's what this is about here. Error number 37, quote, national churches can be established which are exempt and completely separated from the authority of the Roman pontiff, close quote. Yeah, this specifically goes against the Anglican Church, the Church of England. There were other nations who had similar ideas of establishing national churches. Also, some of the Protestant nations had also established national churches. And this also goes against the early ideas of the American colonies, where each colony kind of had its own Protestant religion that governed the state. So that goes against that idea also. And error number 38, last one in this section, what we'll cover today. Quote, the excessive decisions of the Roman pontiffs contributed too much to the division of the church into East and West, close quote. So this is an error propagated by the Eastern Orthodox Church, blaming the papacy and the popes on the division between East and West. When you do a sound and thorough investigation into that matter, you'll see that that's not the case, that the Roman Catholic Church did everything in its power to, even after the schism of 1054, to bring the Eastern Orthodox sees back into the fold. The Council of Florence was all about that. And the Orthodox almost did that during the time of the Council of Florence. But Mark of Ephesus insisted that that was the wrong course of action to take, and has pretty much all but burned that bridge. Although we're hopeful that we can be reunited to form a united Christendom in the future, because a united Christendom is really the only solution to the globalist New World Order that we have today, in favor of the Old World Order, which we represent on this channel. So this is part 1 of the syllabus of errors. Next time we'll do part 2. So you can kind of grasp an idea of the errors that the church was dealing with in the 19th century during the pontificate of Blessed Pope Pius IX, and that these errors have continued to this day because the church was only able to suppress these errors and these ideas for so long, and then we'll eventually get to the point where the church kind of surrendered and kind of, instead of fighting against the state, which was propagating these errors, eventually bent the knee to the state and stopped fighting. So the church militant became the church surrendered, and that was, of course, during the Vatican II Council and the decades after, which we are still suffering the effects and consequences and fruit of today. So we are making our progress through church teaching and church history, getting to, and we'll eventually get to the point today. So we're discussing all the errors which used to be taught as erroneous, which has now been either reversed or placed under such ambiguous, flowery language that they are all but reversed and contradicted by the Modernists ruling the church today. So don't forget to pray for the church, the sanctity of the church, the return of the sacraments, and God bless you. In nomine Patris, Filii, Spiritui Sancti. Amen. God bless.